Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. We welcome everyone back to Behind the Minbar, Blueprints for a Better Masjid. And there is no such thing as a better masjid without filling the masjid with money. Inshallah, this being our newest episode will be about fundraising like a pro. Inshallah ta'ala, professionalizing our fundraising efforts, strategies. It's no secret that the masajid, either due to being in their formative years or early decades, in their startup phases, if we're going to use management lingo or infrastructure, and due to the rapid growth and demand for more and more masajid and better services at masajid, there's not a masjid probably out there that does not have budget constraints. And without pointing a finger and identifying the pain point that we all know, that a lot of this could in fact be self-inflicted. I won't say that. But what I will say is that I hope this episode, inshallah ta'ala, will be a reason to remember that it's not always about working harder. A lot of times it's just about working smarter. A lot of times it's about giving the bread to its baker, looking for the subject matter experts in our communities or producing subject matter experts. I am honored to have one with me this evening, who I promised him several times already after disproving, my strategies that I was overconfident in. I promised him I won't disagree with you anymore. I won't get in your way anymore. I'll defer to your expert opinion now. Brother Qasim, Jazakallah khair for being with us, man.
Jazakallah khair.
Before I even get into so many of the gems that I want to draw out of you and the hacks, the strategies that I'm sure people will be very glad to take from this episode and deploy it right away. A lot of it is going to be very practical, as you've always been with us. But why you? Why would I even invite you on this thing?
I had the same question.
Qasim is my man from a very long time ago, but alhamdulillah, he's done his bachelor's in international studies, right?
Yes, alhamdulillah.
And you're currently completing or working on your master's in philanthropic studies.
Correct. Yes.
And that big word means charitable work, philanthropic, from Indiana University. And you've been involved with the youth here in the Northeast and Oklahoma and Dallas, mashallah, some of the major masajid. You're currently serving as the director of community engagement and development at Yaqeen Institute. And you serve here, alhamdulillah. We're very honored to have your counsel and your leadership here at IECPA as the Funds Development Director. So lots of big words, lots of sort of niche terms. Maybe just let people know. I know you're going to be sort of humble and be all Muslim about it and stuff. But what is this space and how sort of developed is this space, especially in our societies, in the academic world, in the professional setting, in the nonprofit world? Like, is this a specialty or not? I think a lot of people may not even know that to begin with. So a little bit of your journey just to widen our conceptualization of what's out there.
Yeah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I sort of stumbled upon it, actually, by accident. Taking a few classes on international studies, that was my area of, kind of study. And I was working in an international humanitarian organization and had to take an elective. And one of the courses was Principles of Fundraising. And it was like, I was kind of taken aback, like, how can you study fundraising? I thought it's just something, there's certain speakers you invite to your events and they fundraise. Like, what is there to really study? This was, I would say, 2018, about 5 years ago. And almost everything the professor, and this was, your typical college professor, been there 40 years. This was his field of study, old guy, just talking about like fundraising best practices. Like, it was the truth no matter what, right? And I'm sitting there like almost everything he mentioned to do, none of the organizations I was familiar with were doing. And almost everything he mentioned not to do, we were all doing. And so I was like disagreeing on a lot of, not disagreeing, but it was like almost contradictory. Like, what you're telling me is not what we're doing, but we're raising money, like we're raising millions. And so that was just kind of the first experience, to better practices, different ways of fundraising. I'll fast forward a few years and actually question anyone viewing, I'll ask as well and maybe pause for a bit. I was standing in front of, after kind of just learning just going through that class for an entire semester. I stood in front of a room of about 80 professionals working in a fundraising organization, right? And raising funds day in and day out. And my question to them was, who can name a fundraiser? And so they all started thinking, right? And if you're viewing, maybe think like, who is a fundraiser to you?
Like an individual
Like
who is
a person, right? Like a human being.
an expert, right?
Yeah. And so, yeah, Imam Siraj Wahaj is a fundraiser, Dr. Altaf Hussein, Munzir Talib. And then I'm like, okay. And these are people year in, year out raising $2-3 million. But none of them thought to mention themselves, right? And so that was kind of the paradigm shift, was that you are the fundraiser, right? Like an individual can be the one out there raising funds for a cause, a cause they feel passionate about. And that was kind of what this professor kind of instilled in us through, 4 months of material, was that it starts with a cause that you are passionate about. Like, do you have a right and a just cause that you believe in? And if you do, you would advocate for it. And if you're advocating for it, you would want it to succeed. And if you want it to succeed, you will help find resources for it to succeed. And you are a fundraiser then. So that was, that was a starting point, I would say. Then about a year later, I got introduced to the Center for Muslim Philanthropy, something, again, I didn't know existed. Dr. Tariq Siddiqui is kind of, the pioneer of Muslim philanthropic work in that sense. So we had this professor who was kind of talking about how most non-Muslim organizations fundraise. Dr. Tariq took that of 20 years of learning and brought it to Muslim organizations. That's the rest, is kind of history after that. Like, we took Helping Hand, an organization I was working for, Islamic Relief. Many organizations started sitting with him and his institute and just learning best practices. And almost everyone slowly started understanding, like, the way we've been fundraising the last 20, 30 years is a way, but it's not the most effective way. And so
No, that's huge,
yeah.
subhanAllah. I mean, people need to always recognize the value of widening your conceptualization of any concept to make sure you're accounting for all the opportunities. It's almost like I started the episode saying every masjid has budget constraints, and you rightly said everyone is fundraising and making money, right? But only when you realize how much more opportunity there is do you realize how much growth there is in this space, right? The opportunity cost. Who's doing other than what we are doing? And the Prophet ﷺ, interestingly, would constantly tell people, that you can look outside at someone doing something better than you. And there's some controversy on that, the wording of the hadith. But the fact is that wisdom, expertise is the lost property, is the wording of the reported hadith of the believer wherever he finds it. So we should be on the lookout. It's almost like Allah Azza wa Jal divided truth or sprinkled truth throughout His creation to test our humility, also our tenacity to pursue it in all the different walks of life. And maybe for another episode, when you think about even endowments and otherwise, if we have time, we'll circle back to it. But a lot of this stuff is not even outside. It is currently outside. It was learned from the inside, imported into their worlds, their civilizations, and we kind of forgot it. But there are other things that are sort of developments of the modern world, of our current contemporary day and age, that we need to leverage. So stop and say, wait, what does fundraising look like? Not to us, not to sort of our little subculture as Muslims, but what is fundraising to others, right? Compare and contrast, so that it's not just what's the return on the investment of our efforts, but what's the cost? What didn't we catch? That's a beautiful way to think about it. Is there a particular definition for all things fundraising, or a way for people to have a placeholder on?
Yeah, so the fundraising, constitution, if you will, like day one, when they instill in you, like, these are the fundamental principles of fundraising. So they call it the 6 rights of fundraising. Rights, RIGHTS, right? What
This
are
is
the 6?
how we should think about it, checklist form.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the reason why it's 6 rights is fundraising is ... the right person, right? So it starts with an individual, the right person asking the right donor for the right amount in the right way for the right cause at the right time, right? And a good way to understand that is just kind of look at its opposite, right? Is there a wrong person to ask someone to give funds? Is there a right person who asked the wrong donor to give funds? Is there a right person who asked the right donor for the wrong amount, right? So these are some of the ways to kind of look at it. Why like this needs to be studied a little bit more is that as a Muslim community, as you kind of hinted at as well, we're leaving a lot of money on the table, right? As they say. There are people, right? Like just imagine an individual who feels very strongly about your cause, whatever your nonprofit is, your masjid, your organization. And this is someone who thinks a lot about it, who thinks deeply about it. But they're just, a person in the community, not working for the organization, for the masjid. They feel so passionate about it that they want to give their best for it, right? They want to give as much as they can for it. And these are internal thoughts that they have. But now when they're asked, you're bringing them, on a certain date to an event, sitting them in a chair. You're bringing, again, a fundraising speaker standing on stage, asking the entire crowd to give, towards this cause. This person may give what they're asked for, but you kind of left so much out there that was not taken in because they weren't asked in the right way. They weren't asked the right amount. There's someone who probably wanted to give 6 figures, but you said, can you give 5,000? Because that's what we need for tonight. That's our arbitrary target or goal for the evening. And so you kind of that's potential like 95,000 that was left there because they came passionate and strongly to give 100K and you said, who can give 5,000?
So you think, I'm going to be a straight shooter tonight, you think sort of these banquet style or, wide blanket or casting that wide net at Tarawih or otherwise, obviously they have their value. No one's going to contend with that, but you believe they're overrated.
They're needed. I wouldn't say they're overrated if that is your strategy.
The entirety of your strategy.
Yeah, and that's most Muslim nonprofits, especially masajid, smaller nonprofits. They do one fundraising banquet a year. That's their annual banquet. All their eggs are in that basket. Where, again, you are hoping, right? There's a lot of hope that night. There's a lot of randomness. We're hoping we throw out enough invitations, enough people come in and fill the seats, enough people raise their hands when they're asked to raise their hands for a certain amount. So there's a lot just left to hope, and maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't, and we're back to the drawing board.
It's crazy you say that because just throughout the years you try to help out where you can. Hopefully the intention's in the right place, but we've just been invited to so many fundraisers that you helped me crystallize, or this crystallized for me at your guidance, to be honest. But when I look back in retrospect, and I got this feeling over the years that, like, wait a minute, like, how relevant am I, in a function like this? I remember, one time, I flew out somewhere, and for one reason or another, conflict of schedule, they didn't check the other masjid's calendar or whatnot, nobody showed up.
Right.
You had like 6 people in the whole restaurant.
Right.
And that was a disaster, right? Doesn't matter who's speaking. But there was another incident where I was transiting to get to a fundraiser in Virginia, and the second flight was canceled due to a snowstorm. And I felt horrible. I was just like, can I rent a car and drive? I was trying to do whatever possible because it was the first time I was ever going to miss sort of a fundraiser. And subhanAllah, nothing worked out. Qadar of Allah. I sort of phoned them, and the exact amount is what they got with just some random guy. So I was like, wait a minute, how relevant are we?
Right.
And I've seen as well that certain communities that have a certain pattern of this is what we collect no matter how hard we try and whatever acrobatics we pull, the typical acrobatics. You bring some of these names that you mentioned and otherwise that really know how to move our hearts and remind us of Allah and His Messenger and how near the hereafter is. It's the same. SubhanAllah. So I'm hearing a lot from you about individual you know,
I mean, how
the
many
right
times
person to the right person,
yeah,
right?
and how many times have we heard, like, so before I was learning any of this, I was organizing fundraising events for like 10 years.
Yeah.
So many times the organization would say, yeah, we didn't reach our target because Imam so-and-so, who was on stage asking people, didn't do a good job tonight, right? We even take someone, we'll call it out, a good friend of both of ours, Dr. Altaf Hussein, right? Like, he'll go to an event where there's 200 people in the crowd and raise $1 million that night. And the next night, he'll be somewhere where there's maybe 500 people in the crowd and they'll raise like 30,000, right? That sounds like it doesn't make sense.
There's
It
more to
doesn't
the
add up.
story, right?
Yeah,
right.
but then a lot of times the organization was like, yeah, Dr. Altaf Hussein was not feeling it tonight. We put 500 people in front of him. And the funds weren't raised. I'm like,
Yeah.
last night there were 200 people, and there was $1 million raised. So it's really about the strategy that goes into it. So back to your question about like fundraising events,
Huh?
it's really, you know, they say that you should have raised at least 50% of the funds even before that event started.
Pre-pledges,
which is you building relationships. So it's almost everything we're going to talk about boils down to individual relationships. So that fundraising, we talked about the 6 rights, the right person asking the right donor. That link right there is kind of what starts it all, and where, you know, the momentum is gained from. So as they say, you know, there's we're probably going to talk about like 20-80 rule, 30-70 rule. One rule is that for any organization, and this is, you know, tried and personally, I've tested this theory now with at least 30 to 40 organizations, that 10% of the community's donors fund 60% of all the funds for that organization.
So they deserve 60% of our effort, you're trying to say.
Right.
Nice.
So what often happens is that so it's 10%, you know, kind of usually funding 60, and then 20% funding 20, and then 70% funding the remaining 10 to 20%.
SubhanAllah, yeah.
What we do often is we focus our attention on that 70%, right? So the massive crowd.
Or the 100, but the majority of which are not going to give that much anyway. So you're torturing everybody and long-winding it.
Right.
And
common sense would tell you the more people, right? The more
Yeah.
people you reach out to, the more funds you can raise, right? But it's really, and we learned this even from the Seerah, the Prophet ﷺ's time. Like he knew who the companions were that were going to kick off that fundraiser, right? That fundraising campaign, who are going to be those first 5 to 10.
Or unilaterally carry it, right?
The entire thing.
The whole thing, right?
Yeah.
Jaysh Ushra, the Uthmans, and Ibn Aufs.
Right.
This is true, like Muslim, non-Muslim spaces. It's just a standard in charity, really?
Absolutely. Yeah.
SubhanAllah,
Yeah.
okay.
So even, you know, you look at universities or hospitals, and
Oh,
there
yeah.
are these mega donors.
Handful mega donors,
And why do
yeah.
you find these weird names on
Flags,
universities and hospitals? It's because that one person left their entire, you know, left all their wealth behind for that project, that campaign.
You know, SubhanAllah, even the, not just the duration of the fundraiser being unnecessary, as you're putting it, because just put your effort and attention behind the scenes in those who will, no matter what, be carrying the disproportionate load. Even the atmosphere, right? Like when you're expecting everyone to be carrying more or equally shouldering, you almost can't resist throwing shade at that point. Like, what's going on? Like the frustration. That was one of the best advices I ever got. And I don't want to spend any more time on the banquets. The banquet is not the buy-all, end-all. Or the Taraweeh fundraiser, not the buy-all, end-all. My father, rahimahullah, he passed away on a Wednesday. And there was a fundraiser in Boca Raton, Florida. And I told him, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to make it. It was just difficult. I told him it depends on how well my mom is recovering and grieving. At the end of it, my mom pushed me to go, and I asked Allah to put it in my dad's scales, and I flew out. And it was very difficult. Like I kind of fell apart mid-khutbah before even the guy knew. He was very considerate and sensitive. May Allah bless him and bless his family. He called in our brother Abdul Khawalda, fundraiser from Dallas, as like a backup, a plan B in case I don't show up or I can't do it. And one of the things I benefited from him, he did the fundraiser, and I said to him, what tip do you have in general for fundraising? He said, number one, be patient, stay patient. There's always usually someone who's like having a conversation in their head with shaitan.
Right.
But of course, don't misunderstand, don't belabor it. But he also said, stay positive. That's the point I want to get to. Stay positive. like the stinginess jokes, the lock the door jokes, the take the kid hostage joke. You may think that they can't see through the fact that you're being passive aggressive, that you're trying to use like reverse psychology. And so I think that is something, before we leave like mass fundraising, that I would like to share with everyone. I found great fruits from it and people's responsiveness, and not checking out mentally and shutting down. When you accuse someone of being stingy, all right, I'm stingy. It doesn't really produce what you had hoped. The second thing is Dr. Hatem al-Hajj actually said something once that has stuck with me, that maybe in another time, another place, another part of the world, the sob stories may garner more sympathy for you and you'll get sort of a better response. But in this day and age, especially when it has become almost iconic of our fundraisers, the sob stories and the alarmist rhetoric and the hyperbolic sense of urgency, that actually could work against you, because it confers this air of incompetence. Like you're always scrambling, you're always stuck, we're always gonna get evicted, we're always gonna lose all our kids. The success stories, part of positivity, the success stories are really people who just want to be part of a winning team. Who doesn't want to be part of a winning team? And so these two need to be highlighted. Our deen is a deen of optimism, but also in our day and age, when you see professionalism and success all around you, you want to share with people how they can be part of success, not how we can avert the next imminent doom, right?
Yeah. And mentally speaking, you don't want to always be the one to have to bail out like every time, because every year it's like, we need to be bailed out.
I gotta get you out of jail again.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think before we move on, I don't want to downplay, obviously, this style of fundraising, because it is how we got here. It is how many institutions have been built. And I know that's kind of the question that comes up, right? There's always exceptions to everything, but we saw this and we did it this way. And I think the last 50 years, whatever was done was needed. But now, we take from that and to grow it and to scale it and to learn from the mistakes, the churches and other institutions have made that are now shutting their doors, to not only obviously involve our youth and the entire community in the process, but to just be smarter and wiser and more strategic about how we raise funds, inshallah.
No, that's fantastic. One last question on while you're on the mic for people. What would you say, is missing? Like sometimes I'm a big believer in educating your donors. Sometimes it's just like, oh, wait, I couldn't do it that way. Oh, I could sort of like, so maximizing the avenues by which people can donate. Share it with our listeners, because you know more than me these, and I think not everyone caught it, and it's just as simple as just add it to the sheet or sort of just speak it on the mic. It takes 3 seconds.
Right. So
creativity
for
sometimes is like what deadlocks.
Or you're talking now.
Yeah, you're fundraising and sort of like, I need $1,000, and he deadlocks. But like, how you're gonna get me that $1,000? Simply identifying for them, like hand holding almost.
Right. I think so. The number one. So 2 things, right? I think the number one reason donors say they don't give is because they're not asked.
Yep.
So start by asking, right? And it doesn't hurt to ask. The worst that's going to happen is you get a no. They'll say, no, I can't, or I won't, or you'll get yelled at, or whatever the case might be. But the number one reason people won't give is because you never asked them. And that, again, goes back to the one-on-one, the personalized relationships. If I talk to you all day long about this great project and we're building a masjid, then it's going to have this, and that, and then we just leave the conversation, you got the person excited about it.
Make the sale, as
they
say.
Exactly. Yeah. So additionally, using every platform and avenue that you can. Not everyone, number one, will give on that night, for example. So give them the option to not have to give that night. We've had at many fundraisers young people who don't have money to their name raise their hand for 5,000 or 10,000 because, number one, they were motivated to give, but number two, they understood that they don't have to give it themselves. They can go out and get it. Right? This is not like
so these are the basically answer all the questions in their head.
Yeah, it's not.
Can I this? Can I that?
It's not a legal contract, right? You made a pledge. Okay, that's your intention. Inshallah, you'll come up with it. Now you can come up with ways to go out and get it. Right? Be creative with, give your community, your audience, opportunities to go out and get the money instead of saying like, absolutely has to be tonight on a check. We need the money now. And then obviously, use Zelle, use QR codes. I think that's kind of the new method now, is put the QR code on the screen, let people take out their phones. Most people are going to be on their phones during a fundraising event anyway. Let them scan the QR code and give, and then share it as well. Encourage them to share it in their groups. We're seeing more and more WhatsApp fundraisers now. And motivate groups to come together, split up that 10,000 pledge in, between 20, 30 different people.
SubhanAllah, you reminded me about Go Collect It. There are many people out there that are just waiting for sort of to be asked, and it doesn't have to be on the microphone. It could be sort of the ambassador of the man on the microphone. Mm-hmm. Someone's, parents could have passed. Or I'm sure many people understand where they can find people looking to give.
Sheikh Mohammad Suleiman, who doesn't fundraise anymore the way he used to on stage actively, but he always used to make this guarantee, and it would encourage younger people to raise their hands. He would say, "You make the pledge tonight. If you're not able to collect it in 1 year, give me a call and I'll come and help you raise the funds." Yeah. I don't think he was ever called or reached out to, but it's just really like giving people confidence that it's not that hard. You can go out and get it. In the age of crowdfunding, social media, we're seeing it more and more, where young kids, no penny to their name, are raising $5,000-$10,000 for causes online.
Yeah, and actually what I was going to add to that, in addition to like going and collecting, is that the light bulb for some people about go collect it from your job, like the corporate matching option, simply turning their attention to that could double, your pledge easy.
Absolutely.
Or I remember one time I attended a nonprofit summit, and part of the funds development segment was that most people, and I too was of those people, don't know that the capital gains tax on your stocks, when your stocks make some money and then pulling it the same year, if you were just to educate them, that you would get, at the time, I don't know if this still stands, 4 times the tax break if you were to donate a stock. And so that would require of the masjid or the center to be open to receiving stocks, and to simply call their attention to the fact that, by the way, did you know that your tax cut would be 4x what it would be for cash if you gave it in the form of stock? These things, I think, would be helpful. Let's get to personal relationships, if you don't mind, because I really want to dig deep here. So the community has trust issues. And when you said relationships, I was like, I don't think those are there most of the time. You just vanish and come back 1 year later and say, come on, guys. Why are you holding back? So how does that work? Like when you cultivate, is that like a one-time thing, or is there like a particular like cycle? How does it work?
Yeah, so there's a famous saying in fundraising: you ask someone for money, they're going to give you advice. But if you ask them for advice, they'll give you money, right? And so really cultivation is you talking to someone, having a meaningful conversation.
And you're not pretending, you're actually giving them a sense of
ownership. It has to be meaningful.
Yeah,
right? It has to be
Make them feel like I'm a stakeholder here.
And meaningful. And that's where the right cause in the 6 rights comes in, right?
What matters to you?
Yeah. Does this person care enough about this? Like if I have a non-Muslim neighbor who's maybe very passionate about giving, I'll talk to him maybe about a humanitarian cause and maybe not about the masjid, for example, right? That's me understanding what the right cause is with that person. So having meaningful conversation with someone, asking for their feedback. You've been in this community 5 years. Yes, I'm fundraising. I'm asking the community to give, but you in particular, what is it about the masjid that you found that it was meaningful enough to give to? What projects would you like to see in the future? What are some things you feel like we should be trying to do more of? These are all things that you'll need money for. So this person is not just going to say like, yeah, you should be doing this, you should be doing that, and not actually, write a check behind that. Like this is someone who, if the conversation is sincere enough and is heading in the right direction, will give you that feedback and say, and inshallah, I'll be the first one to commit to giving towards it. Versus just going up to that person, even if personalized does not always work out, because it may not be done in the right manner, where you go up to someone one-on-one. It is personalized, but you just go up to them and say, hey, we're having a fundraiser. I need $5,000 from you. Can you commit? Yeah. Right? That's where you'll get advice, right? That's where you'll get, well, why don't you do the event in 2 weeks, or why didn't you do it in this day instead of that day?
Why don't you ask that guy?
Ask the other guy, right?
Like, name someone for you.
Right. Why'd you choose this venue? I don't like their food, right? You get all this feedback. So having meaningful, personalized conversations one-on-one. That's where that 10%, right? If the average community has 100 to 200 donors, and 10% are really fueling most of that organization's resources, that's not a lot of conversations. That's 10 to 20 meaningful conversations to fund 60 to 70% of your entire organization.
But to be honest, at the same time, what I'm hearing from you, and I hope all our viewers or listeners catch it, is that it does add up, though. Like, this type of work can't really be handled by most volunteer-based servants of our communities, right? This like automatically, feeds into the notion of, hey, you should think about maybe putting 10 hours a week, 20 hours a week, 40 hours a week of paid staff towards building these relationships, fund development directors. Like, it makes all the sense in the world right now. You know, you even, subhanAllah, answered a question I was about to ask. I have here in my notes about, you hear that the reason why, we struggle with donors, that everyone who wants to donate, they want to stick their 2 cents in. They want to stick their opinion in. They want to stipulate. So how do we retain our trajectory, if there is one? How do we retain our autonomy as sort of leadership? How are we left alone to drive in a consistent direction, not all over the place each year trying something else, when our donors are stipulating? And you just answered it like very succinctly, tabarakallah. Like, ask them. Don't wait for them to stipulate. You determine what they will decide, right. And it doesn't have to be the most fundamental thing that'll overhaul or U-turn your direction. Tell them, within this domain, I need advice.
Right.
And he'll already feel like, oh, okay, so I'm helping here.
Right. So so part of cultivation is transparency as well, right? You'll find that for the most part, I would say 9 times out of 10, the donor trusts the organization that they will take the money and put it to good use if there is transparency and if that cultivation is taking place. They will say, for the most part, I think sometimes people fear like, well, if you ask them for questions, if you ask questions, you ask for feedback, they might give it. And then you might have to do something with that feedback. Yeah. 9 times out of 10, just that conversation, just you asking that question is enough for them to build that trust. And the response usually and typically is, you know better what to do with it. I trust that you guys are doing the right thing already. I have a couple of things, I'll message you, something along those lines. There is sometimes that fear of like, we have to take their word, which you don't, right? So they might give wild feedback on something that is not practical, and doesn't mean you have to take it, but it starts a conversation and opens that door of transparency.
SubhanAllah, transparency is a prophetic principle, right? The Prophet ﷺ would proactively shut doors of suspicion to help people out, like help them against their shaitan. I've been a part of quite a bit of Islamic organization centers, past 20 years, and I've heard a lot of accusations. And to be honest, in front of Allah, I can't sign off to any of them as being ill-intended. But a lot of them are just, you're not explaining to people, so you're leaving room for people to wonder. And a lot of times it's also not ill-intended, but because you don't feel a sense of accountability, or you don't recognize sort of the accountability, right, that you actually do mess up. Like, it's not ill-intended, malicious, but it's poor judgment. It is negligence. It's oversights. Right. Like, at the end of the day, do we fumble some of our responsibilities? Does someone give us a check and it gets lost every once in a blue moon? Yeah. Is there sort of, I never forget the story of like $12,000 in cash in a masjid that you and I know. They were telling me we were going through the junk, the spam in our closet, the Hajj, the outdated Hajj flyer and the pamphlets, and everyone's dropping off sort of their paraphernalia. And we found a bag of Jum'ah donations, 12,000 cash from Allah knows when, right? And so when there is a sense of I'm going to offer transparency, that shuts the door to so much of this as well. It builds trust before people are coming with, a sense of distrust and telling you, disprove what has settled in my heart. Just to confer some scripture to it. One of the events that comes to mind, the Prophet ﷺ was walking with his wife in the dark, and 2 men started speeding up their pace. So he said, hey, you, slow down. It's just my wife. It's Safiya. And he named her. They said, Ya Rasulullah, we would never. He said, listen, I fear that shaitan will sort of like suggest something in your heart and you would be destroyed.
All right.
And so it is prophetic, number one, and it is effective, number two, for us to do that. Okay, so asking, making them feel a sense of ownership that cultivates and sort of primes them, encourages them to even want to give. Transparency, so you mean like disclosures and sort of maybe
so
a financial report or something?
So even, you know, how much time is invested into it. You mentioned, you know, how many hours even, for example. Like, so cultivation, when you think of cultivation, typically you think of like farming, right? Like,
Yeah.
to say that, well, I cultivated one time is saying, well, I planted the seed, I'm waiting till the fruit arrives, right? We know the farmer goes through an entire process, day in, day out.
He's vigilant.
Right. And so that is cultivation, even in fundraising. Like, we're not just going to have that conversation for the sake of having it. We're going to follow up. Maybe they had questions. We're going to get back to them with answers. They wanted to see certain reports or documentation. We're going to provide that for them. Being vigilant, as you said, even includes things like, you know, putting out an annual report, right? Like, where are the funds going? Reporting back. So this is more like stewardship now, like after they've donated, right? So cultivation is before the gift. Stewardship is after, right? So, you know, again, are you going to take the money and run with it and then come back to them 1 year later saying we need more money? And that's where, you know, we talk about things like retention versus attrition, or how come they're not giving again, and why did this person give 1 year and not the other? That's where stewardship, you know, comes into play. I don't know if that's something we want to touch upon now.
I mean, we always hear the term donor fatigue, right? And where does donor fatigue come from?
Yeah. So I mentioned Dr. Shariq Siddiqui. He was kind of, you know, the pioneer of Muslim fundraising. So he's whenever we mention donor fatigue, he said there's no such thing as donor fatigue. It's actually donor abuse. Like, we abuse our donors, right? It's not that they're tired of giving, but they're tired of being treated in the way that they're being treated, right? So it's, again, I need $5,000, 2022, 2023, I need $5,000. The 11 months in between, we never saw them.
MIA, right.
We passed by them in the masjid, even didn't say salam, just kept on going because we know we're going to talk to them on this date when we ask for their next amount. And so, just like, you know, the Prophet ﷺ says, the one who doesn't thank the people doesn't thank Allah, for example.
Right, that's important. And it's not even like transactional. I'm sort of keeping in mind that I need more money from you. No, it's a matter of principles.
Just, subhanAllah, a simple thank you, right? A personalized thank you goes so far that this person will, again, we may see them as a donor, someone who's busy with their lives and other things they're working on. So many times the donor has mentioned that the reason they gave again is because they were thanked the first time. A simple thank you, right? It's not why they gave, right? That wasn't their intention for giving.
But it's a secondary.
But someone else may have came along and said, did thank them properly. So now, instead of this cause, they jump to the other cause, for example, or from one organization to another, or one masjid to another, just because of the way they were treated. And so, a simple thank you. Transparency, again, you gave 5,000. This is where it went. This is what we did with it. We promised you we're going to build a playground. Here's the playground. Here are the pictures, for example. Like, these are things that build trust, build confidence in the donor, and they're most likely to give year in and year out because that relationship that's established. So they say a typical like fundraising cycle lasts 18 months from cultivation to them giving again, right? That's like a year and a half period of that relationship. There's not always giving in that 18 months. There's mostly not giving, but it's that relationship.
Would you recommend for the listeners, if they are new to this, obviously they haven't had the ability to work through and encounter the experts you have, to have like a minimum number in their head of touch points, right? Points of contact with their donor.
7 to 10 annually is kind of what's recommended. So
and
that
this is
includes
like a text message or like an in-person meet, or what?
Yeah, so that includes almost anything from a thank you. That's one touch point. Here's your tax receipt. That's a touch point. Here is a report.
I know donors who haven't given again because we broke our promise on giving them their receipt in time.
Exactly.
I actually know that story twice or maybe more.
Right, and it seems
it's a good one.
Something that's minor, but it's something that goes a long way because now they're not chasing you. You presented it to them when it was supposed to be given to them, end of the year, or early next year.
So would you use some of those touch points maybe to network through donors, or that's like bad practice? Like use the donor to find within his network of maybe same socioeconomic class of future donors to recruit?
Yeah, so typically your major donors, that 10% that we talked about, we would call them major donors, for example. One of the biggest benefit of a major donor is through these relationships, the conversations, they will want to tell their friends about it, right? So they will introduce you to their networks and kind of grow that, we call it constituency circle, right? That network, that circle keeps getting larger and larger, and they're bringing more people in who are like-minded. So typically if someone's passionate about a cause, they're going to have friends who are passionate about the cause. They're going to meet them at dinners, talk about that cause, that organization that is doing amazing work, that may be underfunded or under-resourced.
I have 2 questions and 10 minutes left, so hopefully we can, inshallah, Azza wa Jal, do some justice to them. The first of them is, how do we create a culture of giving, right, in the community? A lot of masajid have a very disparate views on how much to open the door of fundraising for themselves or even for visiting organizations, right? And like what's right, what's too much, what's too little. How do we make sure it doesn't go overboard into an adverse reaction or underboard where you shoot yourself in the foot?
Right. And, subhanAllah, when Allah says, those who give, He'll increase them, right? Or those who give, Allah will give them multifold. It applies to masajid and organizations as well, right? How often, I've seen many times, you probably have as well, that masjid that says we can't allow other organizations to come and fundraise because we need the money for ourselves.
That deficit mindset.
And how 10 years later they're still struggling to raise those same funds. Versus masajid who do need it as well, right? Who may be even worse off than that other masjid, but they are very generous to other organizations and masajid. They won't say no. They won't shut the doors. They'll allow 6 to 8 masjids or organizations to come in Ramadan and fundraise, and they'll give khutab throughout the year for organizations to come and fundraise. They're thriving financially, mashallah, because they've created, as you said, the culture of giving, right? So that first masjid, their Jum'ah attendees, their Taraweeh attendees have not had the opportunity for 26 days, let's say, to give. And now on the 27th day, you're trying to raise $1.5 million, right? Where there was no habit, there was no culture of giving. Whereas other masajid, mashallah, who we're hearing about raising, $1 to $2 million on the 27th night or 29th night, they've opened their doors throughout the month of Ramadan, and that night it's that much easier for them to raise funds, right? So as community members, as human beings, like, we need to be able to get in that habit. Even that notion of like they won't give to us, right? Like, okay, they'll give $100, to the other organization, but you're the masjid that they prefer to give to. They'll give you 1,000. Like, you're not gonna lose out on anything. But again, it's kind of a deficit mindset, right? Just if we allow others to come in and take that money, we won't have it for ourselves. So creating that culture is extremely important, and has to be intentional as a community.
SubhanAllah, I don't want to psychologize this, because we have to believe as Muslims that Allah's promise is true in the ghaibi sense. How it's going to sort of materialize, the money will never run out. No donor ever says, I've been broke since the last time I pledged or committed. But even like you said, it's like a mindset perspective. Like I've been cultured into the fact that that's what it's like, be a Muslim. Be a Muslim means my life and my wealth, right? Therefore Allah Azza wa Jal. No, I do appreciate that, and I hope and think that many people may consider reconsidering or restructuring some of the frequencies, gatekeeping or whatnot. That's great, alhamdulillah. And I would put the caveat, obviously you don't mean this, but don't fear. You can always tell your guests, keep it this way. Please don't sort of like,
Sure.
throw shade at the community. Please don't exceed this amount of time. That's fair.
Absolutely.
Because we want to be respectful of people's sensitivities, people's time, and I'm all about that. If you don't respect your community may not deserve your respect.
Right,
and so
right.
you are almost like a custodian of your community, so feel free to demand a certain rapport. but get them used to asking. I remember in that same nonprofit summit, it was actually sponsored by Islamic Relief, and I benefited so much from that one weekend. They said they were sharing that the IRS, and you mentioned this already, uh, polled what makes people pay. And the number 3 reason was, I believe, in the vision, or the personality, the vision master maybe is the term you use sometimes. The second reason was that I get something back. Like, I got a gift, I got a thank you, I got a tax break, I got a medallion or a trophy. The number 1 reason is they were actually asked, like, why did you give this person versus that person? That person asked me, right? And so when people are asked, the more they're asked, the more they give. But that always needs to be qualified with the balance that our deen always talks about. The last question, before I ask you, what didn't I ask? Long-term sustainability. We say that the number 1 reason to give is to be asked, of course, with the caveats of right person, right amount, and all of that, right cause. Everyone's saying sustainability, and we got these big words about scaling, and sometimes we get a little bit ahead of ourselves that, we're going to, I've seen a flyer once that said the fundraiser that ends all fundraisers.
Right.
That's not true, right? And I don't know where that is true. Where do you actually have like a case where this is true? But the idea of mitigating, or weaning off of our dependency on solely fundraising, right? How do we get smarter about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll combine that with, even as you mentioned, what wasn't asked or talked about. So it's more of a recommendation for every organization, right? So it's called the 4-legged stool of fundraising, right? So you picture a stool that has 4 legs. It needs all 4 legs to stay afloat, right? The person sitting on it would collapse otherwise. And so you kind of picture your organization sitting on the stool. What are these 4 legs? So number 1 is the annual fund. Right, that's what you need just to survive. That's what every masjid or organization said when they say we need to raise $1 million this year, or 1.5 or $2 million.
It's like operations.
It's operations.
Got it.
Just to sustain yourselves, just to stay alive, as I mentioned. So that's the first leg. You don't have an organization if you don't have that first leg. The second leg is major gifts. We kind of talked about that, which is kind of hyper focusing on that 10 to 20%. That drive the fundraising for the organization, that give that 50 to 60% for the organization. So that's where the cultivation, stewardship kind of comes into play. Third leg of fundraising, so for every organization that kind of wants to take the next leap forward, is capital campaigns, right? What are the opportunities to grow, the facility, or expand the facility, or build a new facility, or maybe purchase a property? So this is where, again, you're dipping into the same pool for this as you would for operations.
But you're saying just don't get stuck thinking you can get away with just focusing on operations.
Exactly.
Make this a necessary, non-negotiable part of your budget.
Exactly. We have to be thinking long term. Like, what doesn't exist now that we might need 5 to 10 years from now? And it might take us that long to get there, right? But
and start thinking about it now, it's going to be 15.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then the fourth leg is planned giving. This is kind of where we talk about sustainability, right? Why I mentioned most churches that are around today, even my daughter was asking me a few days ago, we were driving by an old church, like, does anyone go in there? And we're like, no, it's mostly empty. Why are these old churches still around? It's because someone left them all this money when they were leaving this world. They had nowhere else to give it.
So they're on autopilot.
Yeah. And so planned giving is a major opportunity, especially... so the experts say within the next 20 years there's going to be the largest wealth transfer in the history of the world.
What does that even mean?
So the baby boomer generation that currently exists is considered the wealthiest demographic to ever exist collectively in the entire world. They're on their way out, right? In the next 10 to 15 years, if not already there.
Oh, so they're estates.
So they're passing that on to the next generation.
Got it.
That is being considered the largest wealth transfer the world has ever seen. So as an organization, that's something we should be prepared for, right? Having those conversations. So again, I said everything goes back to the one-on-one relationships, the conversations. If this is a donor who, when they were a working professional, you were having those conversations with, and as they retired, you're having the same conversation with them. They may not be giving at the level they were previously, but they have this estate that they're leaving behind, right? Have them write you in their will. That is something that the non-Muslim organizations, churches, they have kind of mastered. Universities as well.
And every Sahabi had an endowment, subhanAllah.
Exactly.
We'll dedicate, inshallah, an episode to that, but complete your thought.
Yeah, so planned giving is a major part of that as well. Donor advised funds, stocks, kind of ties into that as well. And then leaving the organization behind in their will. That's something that often gets overlooked. Even in the Muslim community, I think it's a little awkward maybe to talk about. I think we've felt that it's not something we want to bring up or talk about, but this is something the person has on their mind. Like they are actively thinking about it. So we should be as an organization as well and really have those conversations. This is kind of what's considered the four-legged stool, right? To maintain a proper, functioning, well thought out, sustainable long-term organization. These are some of the things that it would entail.
I have a sustainability idea. We put this video behind a paywall, so all the money we make teaching them how to make money for their masjid,
there you go,
funds our masjid.
There you go. Perfect.
If I was a few ounces more shameless, I would have done this. But I think I'll just settle with asking Allah to write for me and for you and for our parents and our children the reward of the millions and billions and trillions, inshallah, that will be more efficiently secured for the Muslim communities and for Islamic work and for the cause of Allah Azza wa Jal through this episode. You know, it's going to happen, like you said, and we just want to be better at it. And I do think this was very eye-opening for a lot of people on refining their tool, sharpening their their fundraising acumen, and looking for places and people that can do that, inshallah ta'ala. May Allah place all that in your scales. Yeah.
Likewise. And I think one thing we have to ask ourselves as an organization, or just kind of reflect on, is that Muslims today in this country are giving more to non-Muslim causes than Muslim causes. The wealthiest of Muslims, currently. And many may not be attached to the Muslim community or the masjid or Islamic organizations, but they are being asked by universities and hospitals and other nonprofits to give to them, right? And so we really need to start kind of just a little bit of introspection and then strategize on making a list, a fundraising plan, right? Simple things like that. It's end of the year. By January 1st, like every organization and masjid should have a fundraising plan. You should be able to identify every dollar, like where it's going to come from, which donor. And these are things that kind of takes a little bit of effort to sit down and make sure you have a team in place, consult someone if you need to. But we owe it to the Ummah of the Prophet ﷺ to do our best to resource and fund Islamic causes and projects and programs. Bi-idhnillahi ta'ala.
You reminded me, wallah, you shared with me some stats, some numbers maybe a year or two back, that the Muslim community is not just wealthy, but they're also exceptionally generous. They're already giving. And so it's there on the table. You just have to show up, be presentable, and just prove that this will go towards those beautiful intentions these donors have that believe in Allah on the last day. Jazakallah khair, Brother Qasim. And keep us in your prayers, O listeners, O viewers. And please throw in the comments what other subjects you want us to work on. I have about 24 left, but I'm sure there are many more that we need to broach. And we ask Allah to accept from us all and the entire team, those behind the cameras as well, our unsung heroes. Allahumma ameen. Jazakallahu khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.